Hey everybody, it's Eric Byler, and we're in Durham, North Carolina. I'm here with Allison Riggs, I've been filming testify before the North Carolina State Legislature since 2013, when the most extreme anti-voting legislation in the United States was passed. It's since been essentially struck down. And my first question for you is, what do you think Antonin Scalia would say as probably the tie-breaking vote if he were alive and this case had gone? Well, first of all, describe the case and then tell me what do you think Scalia would have said.
So this was a multi-pronged challenge to, like you said, the nation's worst voter restriction law. We challenged it as intentionally racially discriminatory, violating the Voting Rights Act, and creating an undue burden on the right to vote. We got a glimpse of what Justice Scalia would have said. We got a preliminary injunction back in 2014, and there was an emergency stay application to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court then, with Justice Scalia on it, voted 5-4 to stay the Fourth Circuit's decision, and so they let the law go into effect in the 2014 election, and we saw thousands of voters disenfranchised because of it. So I think that was our first glimpse into how Justice Scalia would have viewed this case.
So if it's chaos right now in North Carolina early voting, if Scalia had lived to overturn the Fourth Circuit, and that law was in place for a presidential election, it would be, well, first of all, tell us what chaos we actually do have right now.
So the Fourth Circuit ruled at the very end of July. So a lot of counties had already set their 10-day early voting plans, and it was a challenge to expand those plans to 17 days, even if all actors had been coming to the table with good intentions, which is not the case.
That's right.
So some counties expanded the 10 days to 17 days in a good faith effort to make early voting more accessible to everyone, and some counties did not. Apparently, inspired by state GOP urging to restrict early voting. And so in our urban counties, most of our urban counties, we saw a really inadequate early voting plan during the first week of early voting from October 20th to the 27th. And it hurt turnout. It hurt African American turnout. We got calls about long lines the whole first week of early voting, and then it let up after early voting sites and hours were expanded in the last 10 days. So I think if we had been trying to push all of these voters into just 10 days instead of 17 days, it would have been a nightmare, and it was stressful enough, as is. In North Carolina and across the country, early voting is extremely popular, and if you try and restrict it, it causes problems.
Well, as we learned during the hearings when the Republicans were deciding whether or not to do this, when they did it in Florida for the 2012 election, people waited for 8 hours in the urban centers in order to vote. And so it's not just African Americans, it's people who are frankly comfortable enough with African Americans to live near them who are going to be affected when early voting is cut. And it's a deliberate tactic to cut the turnout in the urban centers where they know it's not only more African American, but it's more liberal leaning.
Yeah, I mean, and the issue too is, so we had a lot of long lines at the end of early voting here too, and people are like, well, we were going to have the last 2 days of early voting anyway. But the issue is, you want to encourage people to spread out the vote over a longer period so that everyone doesn't suffer on the last days of early voting. So at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, the lines Friday night, the last voter didn't vote till 11:45 p.m. So these were voters who were in line 5 hours.
What time did polls close?
On Friday in Wake County, it was 6 or 7. It was a while ago.
So there's enthusiasm to vote, but also there are barriers, and the barriers were designed by the legislature that the Tea Party brought in, and the governor that the Tea Party brought in North Carolina. And essentially, not only did they gerrymander all of the state and also federal districts to advantage white rural voters against urban voters who were all packed into as few districts as possible, they also used that power to try to put barriers to young people, poor people, African Americans, not just a voter ID, but also 50 more pages that made it easier for money to come in to influence elections and made it harder for people to vote really quickly. Other than cutting down early voting and trying to create the long lines in the urban centers, what else did this law try to do?
We actually thought the most harmful part was repealing same-day registration. So same-day registration in North Carolina is where voters can go during early voting and register to vote and vote a regular ballot. People don't realize that when they move from county to county, they have to completely register anew. So they say, I lived in Durham County, I was a registered voter, I moved a mile down the road to Wake County, I should be good to go. So same-day registration acts as a really important fail-safe for voters who don't understand the intricacies of election administration, which is a lot of them.
And also young voters who are aging into the process, and poor people who, move from apartment to apartment are more likely to have a different address one year than they did the election before.
And yeah, millennials who have felt the brunt of the economic downturn and have been has suffered from a lot of housing instability. So, we were talking in the hotline today that millennial homelessness is not about staying at a homeless shelter. It's couch surfing, and how hard it is for those folks to have a permanent enough place to register to vote. But same-day registration was just a critical fail-safe for DMV dropping the ball, social services dropping the ball. These are agencies that are supposed to be registering voters under the Motor Voter Act, federal law. Same-day registration in 2012 meant 100,000 voters got to cast a vote that counted. And so numbers-wise, that's just huge.
And so that's back in because Antonin Scalia is dead, and he wasn't able to overturn the Fourth Circuit Court's decision that you argued on, right? Tell us, what was it like to argue on such an important case?
It was my great honor, and I was really pleased with the questions that the panel asked, and they sort of got to the crux of the matter first, which is this law was designed with surgical precision to restrict mechanisms of voting or avenues of voting that voters of color disproportionately used. I hope that when we got up to the Supreme Court on the full merits, that we still would have won. We might have gotten a Kennedy once he heard all the facts. These emergency stay applications are decided on less than a full record. So
that means that they actually allowed the law to go into effect in the 2014 election, influenced a Senate race based on a preliminary question, the request for preliminary injunction, that was denied by a 5-4 decision.
Amazing, isn't it? And it was 4-4 on the emergency stay application for this election. So, had Justice Scalia been around, probably would have been 5-4 against us after an appeals court found a law to be racially discriminatory, and North Carolina is such an important state in the national electoral landscape this year. And so thousands of voters would have been kept from voting had the Fourth Circuit's ruling been stayed. We're pleased that it did not. And should the court decide to take this on full appeal next year, we're very optimistic that the court will, when presented with the full facts, will uphold the Fourth Circuit.
Even if Donald Trump is elected tomorrow and he appoints a corporatist racist as the replacement as he promised to?
Even if that happened, we would still be obviously making a play for Justice Kennedy, who has in the past been open to pushing back on laws that are racially problematic and racially discriminatory. So he may have been hesitant to come over with us on an emergency stay application, but he's still the swing vote on these kinds of cases, and so we'd still be optimistic and work our very hardest to make him understand how insidious this law really was.
Right. So this whole idea of basically moving away from democracy now that cultural and demographic shift is making it harder for Republicans to win, and going toward plutocracy to make it easier for money in politics to influence electoral outcomes. Citizens United decision comes right after Barack Obama was elected the first time, and then you have the voting rights gutting right after he's elected for the second time, right, in 2013. I think it was July. So if that's reversed, let's say Hillary Clinton is elected tomorrow and a jurist is appointed to the Supreme Court who respects voting rights and maybe isn't too happy about the influence of money in politics, you might argue this case before the Supreme Court and win.
Yeah, I mean, I hope we're going to argue it and win regardless. But yeah, I mean, with a different court, I mean, we still need a Congress who's willing to pass laws, restore the Voting Rights Act. There's a bill in Congress right now that amends and restores Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act under a different tweaked, amended coverage formula. Congress needs to move on that. It's still desperately needed, and North Carolina is the prime example of what happens when we lose the protections of Section 5. So Congress can act, a better Congress can act to cut down on the influence of money on politics and restore the Voting Rights Act. And hopefully, if Congress has the bravery to do that, the Supreme Court with 9 members again will uphold their decision to do that.
Well, the last thing I want to talk about is maybe the most important thing for right now, which is the efforts that have been undertaken in North Carolina to suppress the vote by basically vigilantes. And you're the person who answers the phone on the hotline, so you know a lot about that. But before I get to that, I mean, I just want to point out that the whole reason why the Republican appointees and the Republican Congress has resisted doing anything to restore the Voting Rights Act is that it would worsen the demographic uphill battle that they have with America becoming more diverse, more brown, and more integrated. So if they actually do allow everyone equal access to the polls, it's just going to make the demographic problem they have worse. So I don't see any reason why they would.
Right. Well, what would motivate Congress to act? This Congress is clearly I think you're right. I don't think this Congress is likely to do that, but hopefully, there's in a lot of states there's some important redistricting battles being fought. I mean, the 2011, 2012 redistricting of state congressional districts has sort of cemented conservative control of Congress for at least the House for right now.
Until the 2020 reapportionment.
Yeah, but there are a lot of decisions out there. So in North Carolina alone, we're looking at a redraw for. We had a redraw for 2016, the congressional districts, and there's some cases pending now that may result in another redraw even in 2018. So, yeah, I think until 2020, the room for change is relatively small, but there is still some room for change.
Well, the avenue is through the Supreme Court,
Yeah.
unless we have a Scalia clone appointed as the deciding fifth vote.
Right. So even with Justice Scalia, though, remember the Supreme Court with Justice Kennedy in the majority was willing to strike down racial gerrymandering, which has been a keystone in Southern redistricting strategy this go around, right? Let's pack black voters into as few districts as possible and limit their overall electoral influence. And the Supreme Court, with Justice Scalia on the bench, struck that down and said, this is not an appropriate use of race. We're not going to rubber stamp this. And so then we're seeing courts following suit in North Carolina, for example.
I see you put your faith in the law and not in partisan politics, and that's a good thing for an election protection lawyer. So tell us, I'm going to be reading comments while you answer this, okay? I hope it won't distract you, but tell us what's happening when you pick up the phone. What's happening around the state?
So we are hearing a lot of calls about long lines, as I've already discussed. We're definitely experiencing an uptick in calls on voters feeling intimidated. I think that the heated national rhetoric about rigged elections and folks needing to go out and monitor voters, look for voter fraud, et cetera, I think that's really ramped up tensions, and we're seeing the fallout from that. So voters are being accosted when they go to vote, are feeling uncomfortable. Like, for example, in Durham County during the first week of early voting, a gentleman was out wearing a sticker that said vote protector, and he was taking pictures of voters and their license plates and writing down notes and just making voters feel very uncomfortable. And we're seeing a lot of that all across the state. Now, I think it's right now still mostly isolated, so it's one person being a jerk rather than a concerted campaign, coordinated campaign. But we thought that if we were going to see that kind of coordinated effort, it was going to be on Election Day anyway. So Early voting, we learned how to deal with things, how to nip them in the bud really quickly. The county boards have generally been very helpful. They want elections to run smoothly too. The election administrators, these are the non-political folks who are just tasked with conducting elections and keeping voters happy. They've been important allies in this. And if something bigger is going to happen, we always thought it was going to happen on election day. So we're prepared. We've gotten a taste of it, but we'll be ready tomorrow if anything worse happens. I'm also not, doom and gloom. Like, I think voting tomorrow is going to go pretty smoothly. I think it's going to be a close election. I think tensions will be high and there will be incidents, but I'm hopeful that everyone will respect each other's right to exercise this fundamental right and participate in our democracy that way, and that things will go smoothly tomorrow.